I had already did the majority of the second restatement analysis, but I was very distracted in the video because I had my phone volume on. So I decided to redo it, come back, bushy tailed and fresh. So we're gonna do it all over again, but I came up with fun mnemonics. I don't know if that's super helpful for you, but I thought it was fun. So as I go through this, I will give you some mnemonics that might help remember. So remember, the second restatement is a different choice of law approach, and the distinction between the two is the second approach is more about counting contacts, or what I like to refer to as the MSR, which is the most significant relationship. Now, when you're looking at the contacts, if you don't remember any of the rules, then just count contacts. That's just how this state is affiliated with the parties, or how they're affiliated with what happened in the lawsuit that was brought. That can be the most simplistic way. If you don't want to study any further, I recommend you don't do that, but if you choose to, go ahead. So, oh, it's over there. Okay, so second restatement, there's technically two-ish steps, all right, to continue from the original Eaton way. So we're on A for second restatement. So when you're looking at the second restatement, the first question you should ask is, what are the interests? Remember, section 146 is wanting to know what the most significant relationship is, and the most basic thing to do is to ask yourself, what does each state want to happen in this case? What is the result that each state would want based on the laws that are in question, or based on what had happened, and if they have an interest at all. So you just simply address 146 and say, based on this current fact pattern, this is the interest that, stands out the most, or these are the two interests that are kind of competing right now. Now, it gets a little bit more dicey, of course. So typically, the second restatement is most utilized in torts or contracts, so these analysis is going to be based on tort and contract. If it is not a tort or a contract issue, and you are trying to apply it to another situation, then you're typically just going to count contacts with 188 section 2, which we'll go into later. But for the most part, because of the nuance of the laws for property, you probably wouldn't apply it as much because typically situs rule always applies. Almost always, I believe it's like the majority of the time. So, without further ado, we're going to actually just jump right into torts. So torts, remember, is something bad happened to somebody or their property. So some type of injury. So if you're doing a tort analysis, you have to look at first if there is something that stands out to you as a presumption. Under 188 subsection 3, the presumption for torts is that the location where the tort occurred is going to be the law that applies. Now, you can overcome that presumption with two different analyses, which you should do, and we're going to get into that. But the most frequently, there's going to be some type of tort, and it's going to occur somewhere, so that presumption almost always does apply. So always address the fact that under 188 subsection 3, that based on the fact that this car accident happened in California, there is an automatic presumption that California law would apply. However, that presumption can be defeated. Now, if you have a personal injury tort specifically, I'm not talking about, property damage, I'm talking about like my body is injured, right? Then you're actually going to ask 3 questions always. And those 3 questions are going to be, what is the overarching principle of the law that is connected to the tort that occurred? And what I mean by that is, what is the law? Say the law is speeding. What is the overarching principle of speeding? Well, the overarching principle is to prevent people from speeding, okay? Now, why was that law created? That'll take you to the second question, which is the underlying policy, the underlying motivation and influence to create the law in the first place. Well, the law to not speed is to prevent cars from driving super fast. If we prevent cars from driving super fast, that will probably reduce the amount of accidents, which could potentially reduce the amount of injuries or death on our roads, and potentially encourage safety on our roadways. So the underlying policy under this law is to protect residents. It's to protect people on the road. So if you know what the principle of this law is, what it's trying to do, and the reason we created it in the first place, then you have to ask if applying that law would be difficult for the court that is handling this case. the level of difficulty in applying a different state's law. Typically, it's not going to be very challenging in tort cases because every state has their own tort law. So it's really not that difficult for them to figure out how to apply a tort law from another state. They just have to read the statute. Now, another further inquiry that you could do, in addition to this those basic 3 questions, is if applying a different state's law, if we do that, would that impede the reason that this law exists, its principle, the whole reason that the legislature took so much time to proofread it and submit it and get it voted on, the basic policy that it's trying to help encourage? If we use a different state's law, would the law that we're ignoring, would that law then kind of just be pointless? If it is pointless and there's no reason to have it in the first place because we're not even going to apply it at all, then that might cut against whether we actually apply a different state law. Now, on the other side, you can ask, if we do apply this law, would it further the purpose, help further encourage why we created it in the first place, the principle behind that law, the policy surrounding that law? If it further encourages that, then you're looking at an issue that is probably going to be in favor of applying that law, because if we can look at this law and the whole reason that it's created and the inspiration for its creation, it's not hard to apply, and it furthers the purpose and original reason we decided to have this law in the first place by applying it, we probably should apply it. So that actually usually enforces and encourages and supports the idea that the presumption should stand. So you should always ask that for a personal injury case. But I came up with a little acronym, if you will, for helping remember personal injury, and it's called applying POP. So applying the law, would it be difficult? POP for principle, overarching policy, or policy, overarching principle, whichever is easier to remember. And I like that a lot. I think it's easier to remember. And if you think about it, when somebody's been popped in the face, you want to see what law applies, right? So apply POP for personal injury, and that will better help you when you're further defining the presumption. Now, whether it's personal injury or not, after you've decided there's a presumption and you've hit POP if you need to, then you're going to look towards 188 subsection 2. 188 subsection 2 is the minimum contacts, or not minimum contacts, I apologize. It's the counting contacts law, and all that's really saying is there's a bunch of factors there, and those factors really kind of help lean whether we're going to apply this law or a different law, because it helps you solidify who has the more significant relationship. So subsection 2 of 188 just helps solidify if there is a strong relationship or not, or it could help overcome a presumption, because even if there is a presumption, but another law has, or another state has a better interest or a closer relationship to the parties or the issue that happened, we're probably going to apply their law because they have a stronger relationship, and that's what the second restatement is all about. Now, if you have a tort for section 188 subsection 2, what you have to ask first is obviously, where was the actual injury? So you have to ask where that person was injured. Then you have to ask who was involved. So you're going to look at either the parties in the lawsuit, all those that kind of led to this injury, right? And you also want to kind of tangentially ask, okay, and where is their relationship centered? That kind of means, you know, if this person was injured in California and the two people involved in this car accident, one was from Delaware and one was from North Dakota, what is the center of their relationship? Well, if there are people that were traveling across country and just happened to get in an accident in California, would you say their relationship is centered in Dakota, North Dakota? No. Or Delaware? No. You would say that their relationship is centered in California, because the entire reason that they know each other, everything that's related to their relationship, all kind of came from California because of the accident. So kind of look a little bit more in depth about that, because it's not simply a matter of only asking where these parties came from, although that is part of the analysis. Another question to ask is, what is the parties' domicile that are involved in this litigation? As mentioned in the previous example, Delaware and North Dakota. So always ask where everyone is located, what is their location, right? And then another question you have to ask is the conduct itself. So where did the conduct happen? Now the conduct is related to the reason why somebody is injured in the first place. So let's say that the person from Delaware, I'm not great at geography, if you know me, you know that. The person from Delaware, let's say they were speeding through Nevada and they were really trying to get away from cops that were chasing them. So let's just say they started driving recklessly in Nevada and they crossed the border of California into California, and they hit a nice family from North Dakota that had a camper van and they were traveling cross country. But the accident occurred in California. So in that instance, the injury occurred in California. The parties, one is from Delaware, one's from North Dakota, and the conduct itself occurred where? It occurred technically in Nevada because that's where it started. So that's what I mean by looking at those things. And then when you look at, okay, what's the center of their relationship? Well, obviously it's California. That's where everything kind of started. That's where it all happened. And that answers all of your questions that you need to answer. And I also came up with a little mnemonic for this. It's not super helpful. It's just WWHW. I say it super weird because maybe it'll stick in your head. So first W, where did the injury happen? Second W is who was involved, what's their relationship, and where is it centered, right? Third is how. So how did this happen in the first place? Well, it happened because some crazy guy was trying to get away from the police in Nevada and he crossed the border. And that gets you to the conduct. Like, how did this happen in the first place? Well, what conduct is behind this, right? The last one is another, where are the parties domiciled? You could really break it down into three if you think about it. It's three. Is where did the injury happen? Who were the parties? And then from the who were the parties, you could ask where was their the relationship center and where they're domiciled. Then you can ask how. The how is the conduct. Like, how did this happen in the first place? And that's what you ask about 188 too. It's really technically four things, and that kind of helps you figure out context. Technically speaking, if you have three that weigh in favor of applying, say, California law, then at a four, then you'd probably say accident happened in California, and 188 subsection 2 further supports the minimum that there is a more significant relationship for California to apply their law, and there wasn't enough to overcome under subsection 2 that we would ignore the presumption. But just in case, you should always go to the following section, which is section 6. And the reason you do this is because you want to be extra sure, first of all, and you want to get all of the points that are available. And it would just be far too easy to stop at presumption, now wouldn't it? Now, again, if you are doing a personal injury case, you're going to first ask, is there a presumption? And then if there is a presumption, you're going to say why there's a presumption. Then go through POP. Then from there, go through 188 subsection 2. If it's not a personal injury, then you just start with presumption. 188 subsection 2 to count the actual contacts. Then from there, just to be sure, you're going to do section 6. Section 6 has a lot of principles, but you can boil it down to the top 5. And those top 5s came from a case called the JC case, because they really helped articulate the principles and boiled them down into a more workable framework. And the first question that you ask under subsection 6 is going to be interstate comedy. Not comedy like, aha, you're so funny. Comedy like comity. And interstate comedy, technically there's 2 tests that are built into it. And what interstate comedy is asking you, if it has to do with forum law that's of the state versus another state's forum law, so 2 states going against each other, it's going to ask whether applying one state versus another state is going to cause a problem. Now, you're like, how would that cause a problem? Well, if we have 2 different states and they feel very strongly about something because they have totally different interests involved in the case, you have to ask, if we apply one law or another, could that potentially affect their relationship? Could it ruin the harmony of their relationship? If anything ruins the harmony of their relationship, then it would potentially cut against applying one law versus another, because you don't want to impact their relationship or the harmony and peace that they have, because states typically, especially bordering states, and even if they're not bordering states, they are going to want to get along. We want people to get along. We want states to get along. And if we do something that harms their relationship, then it would cause a disharmonious situation and circumstance, which is something that we just don't want. So if something does not support the harmony of a relationship, then it would fail the interstate comity first portion of the Section 6. Now there's another one that you can apply, but we're going to handle foreign law first. So foreign is in another country. And when you're looking at another country, it's the same question. If we don't apply this country's law, is that potentially going to harm the harmony and our harmonious relationship if we do so, if we disregard their law, or vice versa? So when you're looking at the first one, interstate comity is going to look at, is this harmonious? Does it help support a harmonious relationship? Is this good for our relationship or not? Now the next thing to ask, and it's a strange phrase, so I apologize, is commercial intercourse. So let's just say commercial transactions, okay? I'm Christian, and it just kind of feels weird to say that out loud without anybody here. So commercial transaction, when you think about this, think about, if I am a seller of a whole bunch of corn to many states, and if that state disregards a law of my state, would I want to continue working with that state and having them benefit from my labor and my product, knowing that they disregarded the law of my state? Maybe not. So would disregarding a law from one state or another, would that affect the desire or economy in any way? If it affects the desire for somebody to work with that state, it affects their economy directly, which affects the commerce, right? It affects the economy as well if, rates might go up if this person stops providing corn. So when you're looking at commercial transactions, you're looking at, is this going to affect my desire to be in business with this person? Is it going to affect my desire as a state to be in business with the other state? As a country, is it going to affect my ability or desire to want to work with the United States or work specifically with Florida or California or whatever? The two questions you ask on our interstate comity is, does this affect the harmonious, state of our current relationship? Now, that doesn't mean that your relationship was good to begin with. It just means you don't want to make it any worse. But then you're just going to ask, is this going to support the actual desire to work with these people? Does it encourage commercial transactions? Does it encourage economic benefit of both sides? And even if one side benefits more than the other, it doesn't really matter. You're just looking at the economy portion, okay? That's under the first part. I know, super exciting stuff. Now you're going to look towards the second one, which is expectation. Expectation is very simple. It's really more of the parties themselves. Do you expect the people in this circumstance, do you expect that they would have thought that they would have been brought to court over something like this in this court? It's very simple, right? If I get in a car accident in California, do I expect to be sued in my home state or the state that I caused the tort? I'm probably going to assume I'm going to get sued in the state that I caused the tort, right? So it's really basic common sense. To know it's not that common, but you're not common, you're special. So because you're special, you know that you're going to think, okay, if I was in this situation, if a reasonable person was in this situation, would they reasonably foresee that they could be sued in this state because of this thing that happened? Or do they think it's completely weird, they had no idea, there's no way they could have prepared, this is totally throwing them for a loop? And you have to think about that on both sides. If one party was 100% expecting to be sued in the other state and one party was not, maybe potentially that will weigh against it. So you just kind of have to ask that question, like, would they have expected to be sued here? And if not, why? And if so, why? And that's literally all it is. It's really very simple. It's what would this person think is going to happen? It's kind of like, what did you expect? What did you expect, right? Now, the third one is one of the more important ones when you're looking at Section 6. And the third one is, I call it pulley. It is, I don't know why I call it pulley, I'm so weird. It is going to be the interest of underlying law. And I call it pulley because it kind of goes back towards policy. Now, if you've already done, if it's a personal injury, you've already done POP, you've probably beaten to death the policy behind the law already. But if not, Section 6 is going to ask you pretty much the exact same thing. But even if you've already done it, just to make sure your Section 6 analysis is clear, maybe go do it again, or you could copy and paste it, whatever's easier for you. So what I mean by the underlying law is we're looking a little bit deeper than just the policy. We're looking at the interest itself of the state. So this underlying law that we have, as a state, why do we care if it's followed? Why do we care about it being applied in this instance? What is our interest here? Do we have any skin in the game regarding this policy, whether it's used or not? That's why it's one of the more important ones, because if the state has a very strong interest in enforcing this law, especially in this case, because of the underlying reason we have this law in the first place, that's a very strong interest that will actually weigh in favor of one state versus another. Now you're probably wondering, okay, you're making sense so far, but what do you mean? So if we have a law against, say, running from the police, fleeing from the police, and it causes a police pursuit chase, and the reason we have a law against pulling over for police vehicles is for the protection of the public so we don't have these long-winded chases. Why do we have that law? We have it to protect the residents of our community. Okay, makes sense. The underlying reason makes sense. That person runs from the police, gets in a car accident, and kills somebody. The reason we have this policy is so people do not die in our state. If this law is not enforced, if this law is not applied, then the entire reason for this law is like moot, pretty much. Like, why even bother? We had this law to protect our citizens, and our citizen was implicated here, and they died because somebody did not follow our policies. Because somebody didn't follow our policy, our law, somebody else died. So we have a strong interest in seeing our law be applied here for that reason. You see what I'm saying here? How important is this for the state? Now, if this person broke the law in Nevada and started this pursuit in Nevada and it ended in California and the person crashed and died in California, it was a resident of California that died, Nevada's policy of speeding is probably still important. Their policy about pulling over for police and not pursuing another individual is still very important. But if they did not kill anybody in Nevada, Nevada doesn't care that much about a California citizen that died. Maybe they care on a moral point, but from a law point, they don't really have a state interest as strong as California probably does. Now, the next one is judicial administration. This goes back to the POP. Again, there's a lot of things that are very similar that kind of overlay on top of each other. So judicial administration goes to several things. First, how hard would it be for another state to apply a different state's law? How difficult would it be for the legal proceeding to continue if it continued in this state? How difficult would it be for the court to reach a just result with this law? How difficult would it be for the parties to litigate here? It's just the judicial administration. Now the focus is on the court, not the people. So is it going to make it very difficult for the court? Is it going to be more efficient for the court? Is it not going to make a difference? Most of the time, does it make a difference? Why? Because every state has their own tort law. Most states' tort law is very similar. There is some nuance, there is some difference, but for the most part, they're very similar. So for the most part, when you're looking at something like this, it's going to be pretty analogous to another, so it's usually not that difficult. But don't leave it out of your analysis just because you're like, they can do it. Mention that they can do it because it's not that big of a deal, right? The last one is the second most important, and that's competing state interests. So when you do the interests of underlying law, that one is very similar to the last one. So the underlying law that we're trying to figure out right now, say there's two laws. You already pretty much did the framework of this analysis. Number 5, you're going to compare them, right? So we already know the reason we have this law. We know the underlying reason behind it. We know why it's so important. Now we're going to look towards, okay, now that we know why it's so important, whose interest is greater? Is it California or is it Nevada? In this instance, it'd be quite clear it's California because the person that died was, say the person that died was a California resident. Or even if they weren't, the person that died in California. They have a stronger interest because the tort technically occurred there. Now, let's say that the chase started in Nevada and ended in Nevada. Who would have a greater interest here? Nevada, because it was their law that was broken, and it was them that had to suffer the consequences of this violation of law. So when you're looking at the state interest, just take a step back and be very objective. Because it's very objective. It's who clearly is more interested in the outcome of this case. Who clearly has more skin in the game or is more upset or offended by what happened. Doesn't have to be people that broke the law that are from that state. It doesn't have to be people that are domiciled or have residences there. It just has to be a state that has an interest in the outcome because it affects them more than another state. So 3 and 5, more important when it comes to subsection or section 6. Now I created a little bit of a mnemonic. I don't know if it's helpful, but if it is, SEPJAC, I wrote it out over here. CE-P-JA-C. SEPJAC. So you should always ask SEPJAC. SEPJAC, C for comedy, E for expectations, P or policy, the law, JA for judicial administration, and the last C is for competing interests. I don't know if that's helpful. Some people really like mnemonics, but SEPJAC, or you can think of SUBJAC. So if that helps you remember. And another thing too is if you can remember to throw in a case like the JC case. Based on JC case, these are the 5 principles under section 6. That would sound really good. Now, that's kind of what you do for torts. And at the very end, after you've done all of that, you literally just tally up who has a more interest. So say out of 4 questions in 188 subsection 2, you have 3 in favor of California, 1 in favor of Nevada. The presumption's already in favor of California. The personal injury, all of that, all those questions are kind of background questions, but it kind of seems to give more oomph and context to probably California law. But just in case, let's go to section 6. Let's say section 6, 3 and 5, it's quite clear California has a stronger interest, but from 1, 2, and say section factor 4, it weighs in favor of Nevada. Well, even if you have 3 out of 5 in favor of one versus the other, if the third thing that you ask and the last thing that you ask is in favor of the opposite state, that's still technically going to win because factor 3 and 5 is stronger. Additionally, once you add them all up, it's quite clear that California is the winner. They have a lot more that seems to be in favor of them applying that law. So just add up the actual contacts. Now sometimes when you add up the contacts, one state seems to have a lot more than another state, and that one state that has more also has a presumption in favor. You can always still argue in favor of the state that has less contacts using public policy, but we'll get to that when we get to the very last part of Eaton Way. But technically you could always argue that, and there are states where it's quite clear the outcome should have come out one way, but it did not, because a friend of mine told me, and I think it's so true, is when it comes to conflicts of law, it's really a heart analysis. The judges are pulled by what they think is right and ethical and what should happen, and they're going to try to justify it throughout the analysis to get the answer that they want, that they think is the most fair, even if it's not correct by the law, which is not always a bad thing necessarily. So if you feel like your heart is not in the right place at the end of the analysis for a tort, then you should argue public policy or constitutional limitations to try to argue in the alternative to get the result that you want, and then you can play a real-life judge handling conflict of law issues. So that's how the tort part works. Now contracts, I'm so sorry, is a little complicated, so let me get some coffee to make sure I am ready. Ooh, that's strong. Okay, so when you're looking at contracts, there's also a presumption under subsection 3 of 188 for contracts, and that is if negotiation and performance is the same and in the same state, then the actual presumption is that that state is going to be the state that governs the contract. Okay? Now, if there is a presumption, you should still, just in case, do which section? 188 subsection 2. You should still do it. And if you do section 188 subsection 2, afterwards you should still just do section 6 just in case. I know it sounds very redundant, but the point is, it is MSR. It is the most significant relationship test. You should always double check just in case, and courts often will anyway. And for a test, it just sounds too easy to be like, oh, there's a presumption, done. It's not that easy, I wish, but that's just not how it works. So if you have a presumption, still go through 188 subsection 2 and 6. Just so you know, 188 subsection 2 is slightly different for contracts than it is for torts. So the first question to ask is contracting. Where was the state of contracting? Now you're like, okay, the next one's negotiation. Those seem so similar. They really are. So let's break it down like this. You and I are getting into a contract about buying a pink Jeep for the beach. And we talk about it over the phone, talk about it over email, we talk about it in a lot of different places. But let's just say for the most part, I am talking to you from the state of Wisconsin, and you're talking to me from the state of Arkansas for the most part. So the state of negotiation, Arkansas and Wisconsin. That's what we call a draw. That factor would not play in favor of either state. But that's what negotiation is. Now, what about contracting? Well, we meet up in the state of Illinois to print out the contract and to sign it with a witness, a notary public. Well, the state of contracting would be Illinois. So a lot of times negotiations and contracting are the same, but always break it apart this way, otherwise you're going to miss something. Always break it down. So where was it negotiated? Where was it contracted? Then you ask where performance is. So performance is either where it was supposed to be or where it actually happened. They're typically also the same, but not always because people don't follow the rules. Otherwise, we would have no jobs, which is so sad if you think about it, right? So performance is going to be, say that I wanted to pick up the Jeep in Illinois, okay? So I wanted to pick up the Jeep in Illinois, and I want to drive it home as a test drive, and then I was going to send the money from Wisconsin to you. If I do that, where's performance? You might say performance is where I picked up the vehicle, which that makes sense because that is where I picked up the vehicle. But was the contract fully performed when I picked up the vehicle? No. Why? Because the contract wasn't finished. The contract wasn't completed until you got your money. Once you got your money, we had both performed fully on the deal. Once full performance was successful, you will say at that point that's the state where performance was met. So in that case, performance would have been met where? Wisconsin. So that is the difference there. There's a distinction. It's very important. Now, what if I get the Jeep and I drive it to Wisconsin and I intended to come back to Illinois 2 days later with the money? Where would the place of performance be? It would be Illinois. What if I said I would pick it up in Illinois, drive to Wisconsin, and send you the money a week later from Wisconsin? Then it would be Wisconsin. So follow the money is pretty much the preface there. Always follow the money. Now, I don't know, maybe I have allergies. Sorry, bless me. So, when you're looking at stuff like this, it's very similar to torts, but just focus on the contract because that's the most important part. But it is important where the parties are. With conflicts of law, where things happen is always relevant. So you have to pay close attention, okay? Performance, when did the stuff change hands, and when was money supposed to change hands? Hopefully it's the same. If it's not the same, then look where the money exchanged hands. If the money did not exchange hands where it was supposed to exchange hands. Now, if it was supposed to exchange hands, say in lieu of services, let's say that I was like, I'll buy your Jeep, but instead of paying you, I will renovate your house in Florida. So I was supposed to perform my end of the deal in Florida. You performed your end of the deal technically in Illinois because that's where I picked up the car. That would also be a draw because if they're different states, then they don't really help anything, right? They only help when you're looking at counting contacts if one is clearly the answer. There's one clear state that's clearly the main one. Now, the next one you have to look at is the subject matter. So the subject matter is what's the contract about? What's the heart of this deal? Why are we fighting about this in the first place? Why are we arguing about this in the first place? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to get out of this deal? The heart of the deal, subject matter. If the subject matter is about the Jeep, then it's quite clear that it's probably going to be governed where the actual Jeep is located. And you're like, wait, what do you mean? So subject matter, the heart of the deal, typically has to do with what's actually happening. So if it's a piece of property that's being purchased that's movable, like a Jeep, it's going to be technically where the Jeep currently resides. If it's a property like a piece of land, it's going to be where the land is located physically. Now, what about if it's a service? Like you contract with me in Illinois to do work in Florida, then the subject matter of the contract, the heart of the deal, is to do service on a property in Florida. Therefore, the subject matter is the services that will take place in Florida, so it would be Florida. Just think about where the thing or service is and where it is to be performed or where it's supposed to be performed. Subject matter is not as strong as an indication, but you should always take a step back and look at it because it doesn't always match performance. And I know that doesn't sound super intuitive, but you'd be surprised. So once you look at the subject matter and at the heart of the deal, where is the most of this stuff supposed to be, or where would we assume it would be, where would we expect it to be? Then obviously lastly, you always look at domicile. What's domicile? Where are these people living, conducting business, principal place of business, incorporated? It's domicile is the place that you would expect to find these people, not just because they live there, but their whole life is there, or their whole business is there. So where are these, what's the location of their domicile? Typically domicile is not going to be overly complicated on conflicts because we want to get to the juice of other stuff, but it always weighs in heavy factor. And the reason why is states typically want to have authority over the people that live there or do business there. People that are domiciled there specifically, they want to have authority over their citizens and make them do what they want them to do, okay? I did create a little mnemonic for this. You can see I struggled to figure out what to do, but I thought it was fun, okay? It's holidays and I love sweets. I should not eat sweets, but I love them, okay? So here's my mnemonic. Cake, not punch, some more desserts. Isn't that fun? So C, cake, contracting, not for negotiation, punch, performance, some more, subject matter, desserts, domicile. Isn't that so cute? Love that. I don't know, I thought that was really fun. So, and I had to create a different one because obviously it's so different from torts. And remember, if you're looking at contracting, then 188 subsection 2 is 5 things to ask, 5 factors as opposed to the main 4 that you would typically ask for torts. Now, let's say that you finish, 188 subsection 2, and it weighs in favor of the presumption. Should you stop there? No, never. What should you do? Continue to section 6 with the main 5 principles from the JC case, which we already went over. Step jack. Once you go over those, then you would count contacts. And there's not much that would really change when you're looking at that. Everything would pretty much be the same, especially when you're looking at the interests of another state and their policy. Almost always it has to do with freedom of contract and to encourage economic market and capitalism. So that's what most states want. Some states have additional laws for contracts because of people that are like spendthrifts. They spend too much money and they get into contracts with other people. That is when it kind of gets sticky. And so you really have to look at, okay, whose interest is greater? Do we think that the economy is more important than somebody that makes bad deals? Most of the time we're going to weigh in favor of the state that's really trying to encourage economic growth and freedom of contract, because that's a bigger thing than someone that has a spending problem. And you're like, somebody with a spending problem can cause a lot of damage. That's true. You should see my closet. But the point is, there's not as many bad people doing that thing as there is people engaging in the economy, and there's not as much damage that this person could cause than trying to derail an economic growth pattern or derail the economy or derail the freedom of contracting. That principle is so much greater than this one person. Now don't tell me about the Ponzi scheme. I'm aware people can cause great rift, but most generally and objectively speaking, one spendthrift versus the entire economy of a state, they're gonna win. And you're going to look at fact patterns more like that, or you have a lot of fact patterns that might have contract and tort kind of overlaid. Those can get complicated, and that's where you need to be very objective. Very objective, take a step back, be like, okay, again, the policy and purpose, is it to protect somebody's wallet? Is it to protect a principle of the economy? Is it to protect somebody's life, the lives of the community? Anything like the lives of somebody or the health and protection of individuals on a personal and intimate level, that's probably more torts than contracts, even though some contracts might have those principles. Any principle or any contract or law at issue that's really about the words on the paper, the services, what they were supposed to do, what they were supposed to get, what they expected to get from this discussion, from this negotiation, anything to do with money squabbles for the most part regarding a product or service, that's more contracts. That's more economy, right? Stuff like that. Anything you think about that has to do with pulling out your wallet to buy something or that would involve some type of financial, risk in a civil litigation, that's going to be obviously more contracts. Now you're like, okay, well, torts are expensive. That's true, but it's not the same thing. Like, you're typically not going to be owing someone on a personal level. You're going to be paying like the hospital or, your insurance or something. It's not the same. Whereas usually contracts are a more personal negotiation for personal things. You're like liable for financial issues more on a personal level to a specific person. Whereas a tort is a little bit more broad. I don't know if that helped, but maybe. Now, you're probably wondering, we're done with contracts. You'd be wrong. What if the contract itself had no presumption under 188 subsection 3 because negotiation and performance was done in 2 different states? Well, in that case, you're still going to do the same thing. You're still going to look at 188 subsection 2 and you're still going to do section 6. The biggest distinction is, technically, if there is a presumption and you do 188 subsection 2 and it's still in favor of the presumption, you don't technically have to continue to section 6, but you should anyway. If you have no presumption, you have to do 188 subsection 2 and section 6. Now, what if there's a choice of law clause? There's actually a different analysis for that. But what if there's not a choice of law clause? If there's not a choice of law clause, it's the same thing as if there's no presumption. You continue with 188 subsection 2 and you do section 6 to count context because you need more context now. There's not as much information because there's no presumption. There's less policy to support the reason you're using the state in the first place. If there's less policy to support you, you need to go to further analysis. Now if you have a choice of law clause, there is a presumption that the choice of law will apply, because you guys agreed mutually to apply this law. Now, the issue you're going to have with choice of law, I know, I'm sorry, I just like problems, I guess. But I'm going to give you the way to solve the problems. You're welcome. Now, when you look at choice of law, if there's a choice of law clause, you have to actually take a step back. And you have to go to section 187. And the reason you're going to go to 187 is, even though typically a choice of law clause we're going to find to be enforceable because both people agreed in writing, we're going to double check because there's usually an issue with the choice of law. And we're going to double check under what is called section 187. 187 asks 2 important questions. 1, they ask if this is a default issue. A default issue for contracts regarding choice of law is if we had put something in this contract, like a boilerplate type of term. If we had put this term in the contract, would it have resolved this problem? Could we have contracted out of this problem? If the answer is yes, we could have contracted out of this problem, then it's a default type issue. If it's a default type issue or concern under 187, subsection 1, then you're going to enforce the choice of law clause. And to be safe, you should probably still do 188 too, but you totally don't have to. However, you should always still do subsection or section 6. So just think, after all of these contracts, always do section 6. It's really helpful, okay? So default, double check yourself with section 6. If you want to be extra, you can do 188 too, but 188.2 is really to try to overcome a presumption or help count contacts, but choice of law kind of is a little bit more powerful. But if you want it to be extra, go for it. Let's say under 187 subsection 1, it was not a term that we could have contracted out of because it was material to the deal, or there's no way we could have actually created this term. It doesn't make sense that we should have done so. It just doesn't make sense, right? So remember, 187 section 1 is, could we have contracted out of this? Could we have done something to resolve this before it happened? Whereas subsection 2 of 187 is asking, Is there a problem that we could not have contracted out of? If the answer is yes, then that's known as a mandatory issue. Mandatory issue regarding the contract means that you have to go to two very important questions. The first one is, do the parties have a substantial relationship to the state? Or does the state have a substantial relationship to the transaction? If there's a substantial relationship with the state and either the parties or the transaction itself, that's going to weigh in favor of that state's law applying. Because under the mandatory consideration is, what would we mandate a courts to apply regarding a law? Well, we're probably going to mandate the court to apply the law that impacts the state regarding the contract the most, or regarding the parties the most. Because remember, the contract is all about the economy and it can really affect the economy. However, the people living and domiciled in a state, we as a state, we really want to enforce our power over those people. So they're both very important. So if you have either, that kind of weighs in favor, right? So what about the second question? The second question to ask is there a reasonable basis for the choice of law clause? So under 187, section 2, if it's not a default issue, you're like, okay, it's a mandatory issue. It's a mandatory issue, and we say under section 1, yeah, there's a substantial relationship. Or what do we say? No. If there is no substantial relationship, then you have to really ask yourself, is there a good reason why we chose this law in the first place? There's a case called the 1-800-JUNK case. That case, the two contracting people were from totally different states. Their choice of law clause was a different state than where they were domiciled and where they were contracting, and nothing really seemed to add up. So under 187, section 1, it was a default clause that they technically could have contracted out of by choosing a different choice of law, but they didn't. So we continued to mandatory. And the first question they asked, did that state that they chose their choice of law, did that state have a substantial relationship to either party? No, they did not. Did that state have a substantial relationship to that transaction, the heart of the deal of that contract? No. So they're like, okay, well, if the answer is no, let's ask, was there a good reason why you chose this state's law to apply anyway? Was there a good reason? Is there a reasonable reason why it makes more sense to apply our law than yours, of your state, or this person of their state, or the state in which the contract was actually performed? If you have some type of reason that could solidify a good enough reason, then they'll enforce the choice of law clause. In that case, I don't agree that there was a good reason. But part of what they said is, well, people were from different states, and the state that they chose was in the middle. So technically, geographically speaking, it made sense. It was reasonable to assume that we don't want to overburden either party, so we'll split the diff and meet in the middle and go to this state. Okay, that sounds reasonable. That makes sense. Like, can you objectively say it out loud? Does it sound stupid? Does it sound illogical? If it sounds stupid and illogical, it's not a reasonable basis. It sounds smart or logical, or okay, I can see how you decided that. I can see how you got there. Then it's a reasonable basis. If you can pass the second portion of this, then you can apply the choice of law clause. If it's not a substantial relationship to a party or the transaction to the state itself, and there's no reasonable basis for the clause, then you cannot apply the choice of law clause without going to section 6 and going through all of those principles to really see if that choice of law clause makes the most sense. So I'm going to go through this real quick again. If there's a choice of law clause, go to 187.2, okay? Under 187.2, see what they say. If you're able to pass the two questions under this section, you can apply the clause. If you can't, you should go to section 6. Now, if there is no choice of law clause, you could always go under 187.1 to see if it's a default clause, or if there should have been a clause, you can contract out of it. But typically, you only go to 187 if there's a choice of law clause. What I do, because I kind of feel like 187.1 is very unnecessary because it really doesn't make sense, is I just go through it anyway. And I always say under 187.1, this is, the parties could have contracted out of any issues with the choice of law clause that they chose if they had specified their reasoning for choosing this state. Or I would say there's really no boilerplate term that would have been able to substantially support the choice of this clause. Therefore, I'm going to go to 187.2 to see if I can further decide if this clause should be enforced. So that's kind of the gist of it. The most important part of choice of law analysis is actually this part, is the mandatory part, because these two questions really will weigh in favor of applying the clause or not. And it obviously ends in section 6. Everything always ends in section 6, unfortunately. Now, there's an exception to a choice of law clause. And there's also an exception, generally, I feel like you can apply to all contracts. And the exception is the material interest exception. The material interest exception states, even if we count contacts like we're supposed to, using section 188, using section 6, using section 187, and we are coming up with the state of Washington. And it appears that the state of Illinois has a material interest in this litigation, and we ought to, in fairness, apply their law, even though Washington has way more contacts, they have a more significant relationship to the parties or the transaction, we're going to apply Illinois law. But you have to see, is there a material interest that's so much greater than this other side, so much greater than this other state, that it can throw all the contacts in the water because it's so profound that, in fairness, we really should be applying this law because that interest is so much greater. Shouldn't we just do that? And that's the exception. It's called the material interest exception. I feel like there's really not even a lot of questions to ask. It's really, in fairness, should we just apply this law? So this is the second restatement. It's kind of convoluted, but the most important thing to always remember is with contracts, you have section 188, subsection 2, and subsection 3. Choice of law, you have 187, and you only go to choice of law, or you only go to 187 if you have choice of law. Section 6, you should technically do at the end of every analysis, but technically, you don't have to do it if 188, subsection 2, and presumption are on the same side, and if the choice of law clause passes 187 section 2. Then you don't technically have to do section 6. I recommend doing it anyway. Section 188 subsection 2, I think you should always do because it gives you all the answers for negotiation and performance, and it can help you get an idea of the interests of the states. But technically, if you have a choice of law clause, you don't have to do it because choice of law kind of feeds into that presumption a little bit. But if you have a choice of law clause, I recommend doing 188 section 2, section 6, and obviously 187, because that always helps. Does it matter what order you go in? No, but if you keep it in order, it'll be easier to remember. So hopefully that was helpful. I hope you like my acronyms. I'll say it again in case you loved them. Personal injury, apply POP. Torts, apply WWHW. For contracts, apply SEPJAC. If you have a choice of law principle that does not need 187, always apply SEPJAC if you're applying section 6, because SEPJAC is for section 6. And if you're looking at 188 section 2 for contracts, remember, cake, not punch, some more desserts. And I believe that is all. Good luck.